to Wellness Wednesday. I am Dr. Misty Kosciuszko, and today we are going to be talking about a very great question that many of you have, which is what exactly, I'm going to take these off because of my glitter, what exactly is trauma, and how do you know if you have trauma, and what does it mean if you have it, and how is it affecting you in your health? So, trauma by definition is something of a is more of a personal experience. Okay, so the only person that can define what is quote unquote traumatic is the individual experiencing it. Okay, so what might be traumatic for somebody isn't necessarily traumatic for another person. So it's all about the perceived aspect of what is happening. Okay, so that's really what defines a traumatic event. How do you know if trauma has affected you? I think this is a great question, and I want to answer this as thoroughly as possible. So there are all different levels of how trauma affects us. Most of us throughout our lives have experienced at least or minimal micro traumas. Um, so it could have been something as little as, um, you know, little Johnny at the schoolyard ignored you or stopped being your friend and never gave you closure. Or it could be as large as um, human trafficking. Okay, so um, those are literally the differences between a micro trauma and a major trauma event. Um, and it doesn't diminish any, this isn't to diminish any of the micro traumas that we have. It's just to give name to and define and help people define um, what creates this in an individual psyche and body. And most of us walking around have some sort of trauma of some sort. Um, when it becomes problematic is when if the traumatized person or trauma experience is so great or so prolonged that it creates an effect on the nervous system. Okay, so typically known as post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is something that people get after a said traumatizing event. So, say you are somebody who, I just want to put a trigger warning out there for anybody watching. If you have had any sort of, extreme traumas or anything, please be mindful as you're watching this video, because there may be mention of things that might be upsetting to you. So post-traumatic stress disorder would be something on the lines of usually a once or twice type of event. This may have been an individual who is in a war. This may have been somebody who experienced something traumatic, like somebody who might have been maybe at the World Trade Center. I'm probably dating myself with that, but back in 2000, I think it was 2000. It's terrible. I need to look back on that. Um, no, it was later than that, 2001. Comment below, tell me when the World Trade Center went down. Anyway, I'm going to get back to the subject. I know I was in college, and I'm pretty sure it was a couple years in. So, I digress. If you had watched a scary incident go down, or if you were a victim of mugging, you might have post-traumatic stress disorder. So those are the things that happen from an event that becomes kind of imprinted in your neurological system that is very heavy, very hard to process, and so your nervous system goes back over it. Your body becomes you can create like a hypervigilance. Your body becomes almost imprinted with that traumatic event. It creates more stress in your body. Okay, now another level to this is something called complex PTSD, which really has to do with a prolonged amount of trauma for an individual. And this is typically what I am referring to on this page when I talk about how people with high ACE scores and prolonged trauma end up with chronic health issues. Okay, so if you are somebody with a one-time event of trauma, um, there are things that this can absolutely affect your life. You can absolutely develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Um, and a lot of people, it's sad to see people kind of like diminish their trauma because they think, oh, people had it worse, or, oh, it was only that one time or whatever. But like, it's a loaded topic, and you should never diminish your own experience with trauma and what you feel, because if it's still resonating within your body, if it's still in your mind, if it's still bothering you and affecting your life, then that's what matters. It doesn't matter, the comparison of one trauma to the other. For other people, what may have been traumatizing for you might not have been traumatizing for another person. Okay, what matters is if it's still affecting you, and it's having an effect on your life, and it's having an effect on your health. Okay. With complex PTSD, this is a newer type of disorder, supposedly, that's been identified by not just a single event of stress, but people who have been in positions, and definition meaning um, feeling like in an inescapable, prolonged position of traumatic experience. So this may be an individual who has experienced human trafficking. This is maybe an individual who was caught in a concentration camp. This may be an individual, more commonly, that had a chronic abuse history. And so it really is defined by not just a single event, but a complex amount of chronic um, feelings of trauma, and unable to escape the situation, or seeing no way out. That is the type of situation that creates a lot of problems for people. And I just wanted to put that in perspective, um, in a health aspect, because people, there are so many, the statistics on, especially right now with coronavirus and quarantine, um, there's the abuse statistics are going through the roof. And it just breaks my heart to hear and see all these things, and how these children's lives are going to be affected years down the line. Even if they are okay within the next year or two, um, the effects on the human body after it experiences trauma um, can be very detrimental and leave an imprint on even brain structure. So we know that prolonged structure, or being in an abusive environment, particularly during the time of youth, can actually lead to significant brain changes. So what does this mean for you if you are somebody who's like, yeah, I didn't realize I was somebody who had trauma, or there's all different types of, abuse. Some people think because there was no physical abuse happening, they weren't hit, they weren't molested, they weren't whatever, they weren't in, overseas in war. How can they have complex PTSD? Well, the answer is that there's multiple different types of trauma, and there's multiple different types of abuse. Okay, and so there's neglect, there's financial abuse, there's emotional abuse, and psychological abuse. Somebody canceling your reality constantly and trying to tell you stuff didn't happen, or whatever it may be, or um, there's all different types of levels of trauma. So it's very important for individuals to understand what the meaning of trauma is, so they can get the best help and success for themselves in their health. Because I truly feel that a lot of the anxiety disorders and all this stuff. And I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm taught to diagnose. But in the realm of the human body and in the realm of natural healing, I believe very firmly that there are every disease process, especially with epigenetics, especially with biochemical individuality. We all are different. Um, there's always some sort of root to the disorders that are on the CPT, um, the ICD-10 codes. Okay, there's always some sort of root to the disorders. Okay, and one of them is definitely trauma. Now, I've heard so many people and so many people I've coached or patients be like, no, 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 I had nothing significant happen to me when I was younger or anything like this. I don't really remember anything. I don't remember being, alive for most of my life, but I don't remember any significant incidents. And so to me, I'm saying, oh my gosh, okay, this person might have, and it's not always, there's a multitude of different things, but one of the things that pops up is this person has been heavily, um, gaslighted or emotionally abused and has a lot of trouble trusting themselves, etc. Um, and so, it's important to understand that um, trauma is a loaded word. And so the other thing is that just because you're using the word trauma or um, it doesn't mean that the person is forever to be stained or um, disordered by specific things. Just things like that, like ICD-10 codes, diagnoses, those are meant as guidance. They're not meant to be concrete and forever you're disordered and this and that. Like, they're meant to be guides to help you to understand what your body is doing and help you to get healthier, right? So I firmly believe that understanding the root causes of our health is so important, because if you can find the root of where it's coming from, you can get to the path of true healing and true health. Um, and so, people who experience this amount of, especially with chronic levels of trauma or chronic micro traumas or being in an abusive environment for a prolonged period of time, what happens is, especially in the insidious, emotionally abusive environment, even in people, not even just childhood, even in people who are grown who have abusive spouses, okay, what happens is the level of stress that this person is experiencing is significant. What's going on in their physiology is a heavy amount of cortisol. Their sympathetic nervous system is always on fight or flight. They're not feeling safe. So if you're in a position where you feel like you're chronically unsafe, your fight or flight system goes off chronically, especially if you have some sort of abuse. People who are abused typically tend to self-blame a lot. And I firmly believe that is also, there is research along this, specific types of feelings of hopelessness, and diseases that they correlate to. There's a lot of research behind specifically ACEs, so people who have adverse childhood experiences, and the higher number that you have, the more likelihood of chronic disease you have. Okay, so it's important to understand, especially cardiovascular disease, especially adrenal issues, gut issues, autoimmune issues. What do all these things have in common? All those things have in common. You see a lot of people with people who have been in traumatizing situations or might have complex PTSD. What are the other things you might see? Chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, autoimmune, hypertension. There's a cluster of all these other things, exhaustion, chronic pain. These are other things that coincide with that. Why is that? Because your body is consistently in this environment and it is adapting to this environment of hypervigilance and hyperstress. So what happens after a long period of time, whether you're a child, whether you're an adult, a long period of time of cortisol release, hypervigilance, storing things in your body, you tend to create almost, um, individuals tend to create a you're almost like a stuckness in your nervous system. You create patterns that create safety. Okay. And so especially if this is in childhood, and this is so important, you start to create patterns and unconscious patterns of things that keep you safe. Okay. Um, and so people who have anxiety disorders or specific types of situations, and again, not all of this is trauma rooted. Some of anxiety absolutely is. Brain health, gut health, diet, epigenetics. There's so many different things that can come, and biochemical individuality, um, genetic susceptibility to family history. There's a multitude of things here that need to be looked at, but we're just speaking specifically of this one root. I truly believe that, especially if somebody has a history of trauma, they have an epigenetic expression of and a familial genes of mental illness. They have an epigenetic expression of having um, the adaptation of post-traumatic stress disorder. There's actually specific gene SNPs that can be associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. You can look back in some of my posts and photos. I put up actually a photo up of the specific gene SNPs that can be um, related to having post-traumatic stress, problems with dopamine levels, eating disorders. What do eating disorders lead to? Malnutrition, other disorders, cancers, right? Bulimia, patients who've had bulimia, there's a higher likelihood of malnutrition and throat cancer, stomach cancer, things like this. So this is and what's coming from the eating disorder? Partially epigenetics, partially addiction, brain, partially trauma, right? You gotta piece out the roots. So the trauma is something that I just want to get this through. Um, the belief system around trauma having to be this big event that happened to you. You may not even know or remember something happened to you. It may have happened to you when you were 3 and you don't remember. The point is that it gets imprinted in your neurological system. So when you get a trigger that wraps around a similar situation, it can create an anxiety or hypervigilance for you. So there's lots of things that can relate to what makes something trauma, but it's important to know that if you it's important to awaken to the fact that there are multiple different types and there's a multiple different ways it can affect you, and important not to diminish that, to really I truly believe that trauma survivors, especially people with heavier trauma, your body needs to have that released. That needs to be released from your body, neurologically as well as repatterning. That's part of the healing process. That's part of the self-healing process. Because if you're stuck in the same pattern of self-sabotage, especially if you've been chronically in an abusive relationship, chronically abused as childhood, what happens is those patterns persist and almost turn into self-abuse as the patient gets older. So it turns into not caring as much about their health, being more depressed, craving more junk food, craving more sugar, coincides with adrenal issues, right? So it kind of all fits into a puzzle together. Health is, listen, we're one body, right? Mind, body, spirit, we're encompassed in one being, right? So you can't just segregate out pieces of a human. Um, every part of us works together. So it's important to understand that levels of psychology absolutely affect physical well-being, absolutely affect brain changes. They affect brain changes. This is one of the reasons why it's difficult for patients to get out of some of these modes and heal, because you have to change the brain as well as the body. Okay? If you're only changing the body, not changing the brain, you're going to be in a cyclical pattern effect. If that makes sense. So I hope that answers some of your questions about what does it mean to have trauma and how it can relate to chronic health issues. The first step I would highly recommend you guys do, if you feel like you have, or you might be somebody who has chronic trauma and disease, somebody who's got a lot of complex PTSD, they might have fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue. Best place for them to start is the book, The Body Keeps the Score. This book is phenomenal. It's written by a psychologist, I believe a psychiatrist actually, and he an MD. He goes into such great detail about understanding how the body gets imprinted from trauma and um, exact ways on how to understand your body better if you've experienced it, and then kind of how to help yourself. It's a tremendous book. It absolutely helped me so much, with the healing process. Um, and it's important for people to understand the connection, the mind-body connection within the healing. We're truly, we live in a society where, you know, I feel like in the medical system, we're kind of like looking externally for a pill to help us, for somebody to help us. Specifically, for an abuse survivor, it's not uncommon to feel like you need somebody to help you or to rescue you from your own feelings and stuff, or to help you through it. And so self-healing is incredibly empowering because we all have the innate ability to heal from within. We all have the innate ability to um, truly take ownership of our health, and reverse the health effects, in many cases. So there is so much hope, and the person that you should look to the most for your own healing is the person in the mirror. Okay, that you are your best healer. Your body is innately very healing, and especially if you are a trauma survivor, um, I send you so much love and compassion. And I hope that this helps to educate you further on what you might be experiencing in your own life or your health, and kind of where to start and help yourself. So I'm Dr. Misty Kosciuszko. Thank you so much for joining on Wellness Wednesday. Comment below, especially if you know the year of the Twin Towers. I'm so upset at myself for forgetting the exact year. I want to say 2001, but I don't want to. I can't remember. I'll have to look it up after this. Also, comment below if you have any topics that you want me to cover or have any questions on next week's topic. Okay? Thanks so much. Have a great night.